All right. I am here to knock out our first lesson for Unit 8. We've got two more units left for the school year. Unit 8 is marine ecosystems. And so we're going to be looking at lots of different ecosystems throughout the ocean. Today we're going to be focused on coastal ecosystems. Throughout this unit, we will also look at coral, at the deep ocean, and at polar regions as well. And depending on who you talk to and how they want to break up those different regions and different ecosystems, there are some different ways that it can be configured. So there's no great way to say, like, here's how many ecosystems there are in the ocean. Lots of different ones. In fact, we'll see that today with coastal ecosystems. There's not just one coastal ecosystem. We're doing one lesson today, but we're going to be covering a number of different coastal ecosystems that show up around the world. The main ones that we're going to be looking at today are the rocky intertidal zones, sandy coasts, estuaries, and then mangroves. And within estuaries, we're even going to break that down farther into salt marshes and mudflats. So lots of different possible coastal ecosystems, and we'll see that as we go forward throughout the rest of the unit as well. So in our first box, there's our bold, so now we're writing. Our rocky intertidal area is an area that is above water at low tide and then sometimes might be below water at high tide. As that water is coming in and out in rocky areas along the coast, that's going to impact the type of life that can be there. There are a lot of things that will live on and rely on just that ecosystem, that rocky intertidal zone, that never even go farther out. Others come into that rocky tidal zone for certain times of year, certain times of day, and then we'll go back out with the tide. Lots of different ways that it can work, but this is a unique, because of that in and out and exposure to the sun sometimes and not other times, a unique ecosystem with organisms that are adapted for that particular ecosystem. So we've got 4 different zones in our intertidal zone: splash, upper, mid, and lower. The splash zone, we do want you to know this for the test, it's generally above the high tide line, so it's not going underwater at all, but it's right at that kind of high tide line, just above it. Think of this area kind of being splashed by the waves, and so there's not a lot of life that you're going to have in this area, but this is where we might find some different crabs and maybe some different clams, and then things like shorebirds that are in that area, maybe even some small barnacles here and there. And then in our upper zone, this is the area that spends the least amount of time actually submerged. It's the part that does go underwater, but for the least amount of time. Only at high tide, and lots of different algae and carnivorous snails. I've got an image of a snail for you here. Not one that we would find in this area, but lots of the big ones, small ones that we might find in our upper zone. In our mid zone, here's where we have an area that is being covered and uncovered by water twice a day. The water's coming up and down, and between low and high tides. This is where we're going to find our tide pools, especially in rocky areas. You're going to have areas where the water gets trapped as the low tide goes out. The water gets trapped there, and some organisms may be there. Some can live there and some cannot. So sometimes if an organism gets trapped in one of these tide pools, they might be in trouble. If you want to see what some of this looks like, we actually watched 2 videos earlier in the year in our tides unit. Brave Wilderness, Coyote Peterson has a series where he is exploring tide pools in a rocky intertidal zone. So go back and check those out. Type in Brave Wilderness, tide zones or tide pools. Pretty interesting stuff that he comes across. So there's a lot of diversity there in the animals that can be found there: mussels, barnacles, anemones, sponges, all kinds of other stuff that he comes across in the videos if you go back and look at those. And then we have our lower zone. This is the area that's going to be pretty much always submerged, but sometimes just barely. It's where that low tide comes to, and there may be times where there's an unusually low tide where it does get uncovered. Most of the this has more animals than any of the other areas, any of the other zones here, but they are not equipped very well for the exposure to the sun and dryness. So if they get caught, these are the ones that are in trouble. So things like shrimp and sea stars, kelp, small octopus sometimes, they may get trapped in these tide pools, and as the water evaporates, there may not be enough left for them to make it. They can dry out and die. It can be a dangerous life living in this rocky intertidal zone. Some of the abiotic factors here include the water temperature, the tide level as it goes in and out, sunlight, air temperature, and then biotic factors can the plants, other animals, and having to compete for things like the just different resources, and then the human impact as well be a biotic factor. Some things that have to be dealt with here. Wave shock is one of them. You don't have to write this down, but I would love for you to soak this in and see if you can remember. Wave shock is just that force that's being exerted on organisms that live where waves are just constantly pounding. Imagine being in the water where waves are crashing for 24 hours. After a while, it takes the energy out of you, and it can be difficult to be in that area and experiencing this wave shock for long periods of time. So these creatures have to be adapted to that wave shock. Some things that are going to be sessile. We're jumping here. Some are going to be sessile, some are going to be motile. Sessile, we've already mentioned throughout the year, is where an organism is anchored to a substrate or a hard surface. Those are going to be things like barnacles. And motile are the things that are able to move around. So our crabs and some of shorebirds and that kind of thing that are able to move around. Desiccation is one of the dangers that can happen in this zone. We mentioned the idea of too much exposure to the sun and them drying out. When that happens, it's referred to as desiccation, drying out due to exposure to the air and sun for animals that are not adapted to that exposure. They cut it a little too close, they got stuck in a tide pool and should not have, and they may not survive that experience. They may go through desiccation. All right, and lots of different creatures that we might find here. We've named a bunch of them already. We've talked about this too. Generally protected, tide pools are generally protected by law and are very valuable for scientific research. They sometimes give us easy access to organisms that would otherwise maybe be hard to study. So they have some great value. All right, moving on to sandy beaches. Not as much that we're going to say here for this one. Sandy beaches are great for vacationing, bad for living in. It's a very harsh environment. You've got sands that are constantly shifting and being moved around with storms and tides and winds, all kinds of stuff that moves the sand from place to place. And then you've got the temperature factor. The sand can get hot extremely fast. You've got to be adapted to that. And then really not that many resources. Just a bare sandy beach, there's just not going to be a whole lot of resources available to you in trying to survive. There are lots of microorganisms that can live in that sand, so we do find those there, as well as some other things. Some of the things that we might commonly see are smaller crustaceans usually, such as crabs, things that have a segmented body, jointed limbs that allow them to burrow into the sand. Sometimes being in the sand is better than being in the sun. So a lot of these are going to be creatures that have a way to get underneath to be able to protect themselves from the sun. And even then, a lot of them will also have a hard exoskeleton that's going to help protect them from sun exposure as well. And then claws that might help them to be able to burrow are a common feature as well. All right, we move on to estuaries. This is where a river meets the ocean. Here we're going to have brackish water. A lot of you may be familiar with that term already, but if you're not, now you need to be. It is going to be on the test. Brackish water is where salt and fresh water are mixed together. You may have some fresh water from a river and the salt water from the ocean coming together in this estuary area of a river mouth. So this is a very, very common marine nursery. In fact, throughout Florida, the couple of like shark bite hotspots they're all inlets. They're all estuaries where you have rivers meeting the ocean, and then that area being a nursery is part of what makes it shark bite hotspots. Unfortunately, also happens to be where some of the best waves are throughout the state of Florida. So perfect storm. Lots and lots of life there, including sharks, and then lots of people entering that water in order to try to surf equals a high number of shark bites. Luckily, they're usually small sharks and very few fatalities. So lots of biodiversity, not nearly as much wave shock here in this area. That's usually calmer in the actual estuary itself. As you get out into the ocean, you tend to have some pretty good waves there, but in the estuary, it tends to be pretty calm. Lots of resources, and then fewer predators that tend to be found. Two different important estuary communities can include tidal marshes and tidal flats. A tidal marsh, or also known as a salt marsh, is going to be a waterlogged area of land around an estuary. It's waterlogged, but it still has well-rooted grasses and maybe some flowering plants as well. Water level is going to be determined by tide. Usually going to be lots of wildlife here. We are not unfamiliar with salt marshes in our area. In fact, this picture is from the Matanzas River nearby. So lots and lots of salt marshes in our area, but around the world as well. They're not exclusive to our area of the state. Some of the things that you might find in our local salt marshes throughout the state of Florida: redfish, sea trout, tarpon, flounder, all kinds of other stuff that can be found. And then you have tidal flats. Not as much of that going on here, but we do have a number of areas throughout the world where there are large tidal flats or mud flats. This is formed when mud or other sediments are deposited into an estuary, and at that low tide, you end up with a large area of just a flat, muddy area, hence the name mud flat. These areas can help to prevent coastal erosion, so they can be a positive thing. And then they're also really great for migratory birds, for resting and feeding on their migratory journeys. These mud flats can play an important role. Some of the human impact on estuaries, just like everything else, is not very good. Of the 32 most populated cities around the world, 22 of them are located on estuaries. So they have played an important role in the life of humans, but unfortunately we have not been reciprocal with that affection. We have hurt these estuaries. So pollution from upstream can come down. There's a lot of places in Asia and Russia, but in the United States too, but to another degree in a few of these other places around the world that don't have the same kind of regulations. And then we see overfishing and dredging that takes place too. It can have a very devastating impact on these ecosystems. Even though there's lots of life there, these food webs can be very delicate. Something goes missing from that food web and it will impact the entire web. Some examples here of estuaries not being in very good shape. Then we get to mangroves. This is the last one that we'll talk about today. Mangroves are the only species of tree in the world that can tolerate salt water. So the way that they tolerate this salt water, that it gets soaked into the plant through the roots, but then it's excreted through the leaves. So they're able to get rid of some of the salt that they soak in order to stay alive. Mangrove roots offer very critical nursing or nursery environments as well. So thousands of juvenile fish species, anything from little tiny gobies to larger sharks. See a shark here in the image. Just very, very important nursery environments. Florida does have some mangroves. We are one of a number of places around the world that have it. They do prefer the southern coast of Florida. Down in the Keys, you'll see lots and lots of mangroves. And then as you go over to the Gulf of Mexico side of the state, I would say Pensacola down, not Pensacola, Sarasota, there we go. Sarasota down, you have a fair amount of mangroves that show up throughout the rest of the southern end of the state. The United States has roughly 2,500 square kilometers or 1,500 square miles of mangroves, and that's pretty much all located in South Florida. We are the mangrove area of the United States. And then mangroves can help keep people safe. The thick roots can be vital to shoreline communities, particularly in areas that get hurricanes that come through during hurricane season, because these do help provide a buffer against storm surges. As that storm surge comes in, these roots do a good job of breaking up the wave and easing the power and the force of that storm surge as it comes through. Those storm surges are becoming an increasing threat over the years, and so the areas that have mangroves, it is truly vital that they maintain those mangrove populations and are able to take good care of them. We don't want to see those disappear, or those communities are in trouble. There you have it. I kind of flew through that one, I think, and it still ended up taking more time than I thought it would. There you have it, 8.1 shoreline or coastal ecosystems. Peace.